All right, greetings everyone, and welcome to a different topic today. I have been spending a lot of time uploading my lectures on to YouTube, most of which of course are for my students who will be accessing them during the time that we are in sort of quarantine during the COVID-19 period. And I realize that as we sort of go through the process, as I go through the process rather of inputting all these lectures, I'm of course really revisiting and rethinking how I feel about certain topics and what I'm learning. And I wanted to just make clear that, the process of feeling a certain command over a topic and a comfort over a topic is a never-ending process. Never do I reach a point where I say, okay, I've learned everything I need to know to talk about pre-war Nazi Germany, I'm good. Because the moment that I stop learning is the moment that I become, an inefficient teacher. I have to be engaged, I have to always be learning, I have to be open to contrary points of view. I've even had people comment on my lectures, saying, hey, great lecture, but you left this out, or, this might have been a little biased, or maybe you should have said that. And I very much appreciate that, especially if it's done respectfully and constructive criticism. Because it helps me, because then I go back and go, maybe I did overlook that. Maybe I did take too much of a certain perspective on something. I always believe that the job of a history teacher, more than anything, is for us to maintain our objectivity. Basically what I mean is that it is important that we constantly teach kids how to think critically, not what to think. We expose them to a variety of points of view, and we create a climate where they feel comfortable to develop a new voice. And this is kind of a running theme in many of my history classes, that I really encourage them to think strongly and to think actively about what they're saying and what they believe in. One of the things I tell my students, because oftentimes my students will say, oh geez, Mr. Tolman, what's it like to know everything about history? And I don't know how many times I've heard that, and I burst out laughing because I say, you have no idea. I said the reality of history is that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. And never ever will I ever know everything. It's preposterous to even suggest that. But some of the younger kids, I suppose, can be led to think that, because I'm talking about things that they know nothing about and that they're learning about. I always use the metaphor that I think of history as a grand, oversized jigsaw puzzle. And every now and again, we will join two sections of that jigsaw puzzle together and go, oh my gosh, we've made that connection. And I'll have an epiphany, a moment of realization where I'll say, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way, that's connected to that. Never will I reach a point where my jigsaw puzzle is done. Once I've come to terms with that reality, then I can move forward and continue to learn and learn and learn and learn. But never ever do I expect that I will ever know everything or ever really be satiated with what I do know. What I like to think that I offer my students after 20 years of teaching is the idea that I've had the opportunity over years to read so many different sources. Certainly during my history degree, I read a lot, wrote a lot, reflected a lot. And what I like to think is that the 20 years of teaching has taught me how to be objective, how to be able to provide information in a way that allows students to feel the safety of finding their own voice. So, lots of very interesting things to think about when you're looking at history. So if you're just someone who's, taking one of my classes, or somebody who's run across this lecture online, this lecture is intended to give you a basic framework of how historians gather information to present certain positions and certain arguments. Most of my lectures don't really have a thesis as such, at least not a strong thesis, because what I try to do is just to provide information, usually factual information. I may interweave anecdotes and narratives and things of that nature to kind of color that that story. But at the end of the day, it's most important for me to provide information that allows you to think further about it. So today's talk or lecture is dealing with what history is. And of course, every class I start, it's always sort of my opening line, what is history? And, you know, hands go up, names and dates. Names and dates is the number one thing. And I've had so many students come into my class who come in with shrugged shoulders like, oh geez, I've never done well in social studies or history. I don't like it. And usually that is because they're under this assumption that there is a great deal of memorization of names and dates. Names and dates, of course, are important in understanding the linear sequential series of events in a period of history. But for me, what is far more important is social behavior. Why do people rebel? What qualities make people great leaders? Who were great leaders? Who were failed leaders? And why? You know, why did the people of Russia in the streets of Petrograd riot in 1917 in March, and then of course in November as well? So to me, the psychology, the sociology of history, if you will, is what I find most interesting. And I always find that once students begin to understand that history has a lot more layers than just names and dates, then they begin to open up a bit, because in history, we're not just dealing with history, we're dealing with economics, we're dealing with politics, we're dealing with psychology, we're dealing with human behavior, you know, we're dealing with literature, film, you name it. There's, you know, within history is interweaved so many areas of study that gives the historian a tremendous opportunity to explore the richness and diversity of history in general. So, okay, anyway, I could blabber about this forever, but let's move on here. The word history comes from the Latin word meaning knowledge, narrative. Okay, narrative being a story. So it's a story about knowledge, right? Interesting notion, a knowledge narrative, right? That's what history is, a knowledge narrative. History is the study of past individuals, Napoleon, groups, the American revolutionaries, and events. You know, the outbreak of World War II, you know. History is biography. That is a work of creative imagination in which the author attempts to recreate the life and thoughts of a particular person who actually lived at a certain time. And to reaffirm, it is not just names and dates. Now here's the interesting thing about history. When I read a history book, and I'm moved by that book to a point where I'm absolutely engaged and riveted in the text that I'm reading, I'm likely inclined to believe that what I'm being told is probably pretty close to the way things happen. When in reality, we really don't know. When a historian goes into an archive and writes a history book about an event 100 or 200 years previous, that person has no knowledge of what actually happened. All that person can do is take a variety of sources, pull them all together, weave them into a story, and tell the reader in a way that is engaging. Some of my favorite books, there's two that stand out because they were extremely well written and they were extremely engaging. The one that comes to mind right off the bat is Margaret Macmillan's book 1919, and also a book called Young Stalin by a man named, I believe his name is Simon Montefiore. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but the name of the book is Young Stalin. What those two books have in common, and the way Montefiore writes, the way Macmillan writes, is extremely engaging. They write sort of social histories. They write like they're telling stories, and you feel like you're reading a story, but you're learning a lot at the same time. Now, what makes them great historians is the way they write, right? Which means that an academic in the field of history can enjoy the book, or somebody picking up a book for a good read to learn something about Stalin will be thoroughly entertained and learn a lot as well. And that to me is a great gift, right? Because history is biography, it's storytelling. It's weaving facts together in such a way that makes them intriguing and interesting. Okay? All right. So when you begin to think about interpreting a period of history or understanding a period of history, for me, as much as I love secondary sources and find tremendous value in them, I really tend to favor primary sources, right? Things that were written by the people who were living at the time of the period in which you're studying. You know, for example, my mother, who grew up in Germany during the war, was exposed to a lot of horror during that 12-year period, or the 6-year period, although she experienced Nazi Germany the first 12 years of her life. The experience of being in the Hitler Youth and the experience of being brainwashed. You know, I hold such value in her stories and her experience because they're being told by someone who is actually living in those times, who can reflect on their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions, their sorrows, their achievements through that very difficult period of German history. So anytime I have the opportunity to talk to anybody, I've spoken to dozens of World War II vets, and I tell you, that to me is the ultimate gift, to have any opportunity to talk to somebody who can tell me about their experiences in World War II, or any event in that matter. So primary sources is to me the stuff of history. They can be memoirs, right? Somebody writing about, reflecting on how they're feeling, journals, and diaries. So to give you an example, during the COVID-19 quarantine, under which we are currently living under, a lot of people are writing their thoughts in journals, or they're writing diaries, you know. When this passes and we move on, they may close that up and tuck it away on their bookshelf. Come 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, when their children and grandchildren have access to that journal, they'll be able to read about their grandmother's experience and feelings about what they were thinking or what they were doing during the spring and summer of 2020. So that to me is very important. It is a work that was written at the same time or very near to the period or subject being studied. So, you know, if I'm studying Napoleon and I'm reading his diaries, that's a primary source. You know, if I'm studying Napoleon and I'm reading, you know, a British newspaper headlines, to what extent print was developed by then, yeah, maybe in its infancy. But if people were reading journals or newspaper articles, they would be primary sources, because things are being written and discussed about events that are occurring at the time. Primary sources are the basic material that provide the raw data and information for the historian. So for me, writing from a 2020 perspective, let's say, I want to write a paper on McCarthyism. I want to write about the United States in the 1950s, a social history and a political history of the impact of McCarthyism on American culture during this period. So where would I go? Well, I would go to, preferably, I would go to newspaper articles primarily first to read about how newspapers were reflecting on this event. I might look at films that were made during the time that might be allegories of McCarthyism. And then I would also read secondary sources, which we'll get to next. So anything that was written about or discussed in a memoir, in a newspaper in the 1950s would be the first place I would go if I was looking to get kind of a sense of how people felt and how people were being affected by McCarthyism in the 1950s. Okay, it's the raw data for me. Okay, now, because of my great appreciation for primary sources, this does not mean I do not see value in secondary sources, because certainly there is, and we'll talk about that as well. A secondary source can be a textbook, can be a history, and can be a newspaper. You know, like a newspaper that's discussing the 75th anniversary of VE Day, for example. Victory in Europe, which just passed very recently. So when a newspaper has an article about, you know, the 75th anniversary and it interviews either vets or talks about the events of World War II, for example, that would be a secondary source, which means that it is something that is written after the period of time in which it is studied. Yeah, it is one that discusses the subject but is written after the time contemporary with it. Secondary sources also works that are works rather that make judgments on primary material. Okay, this is where you get into things like bias. So the great advantage with primary sources is that they're written at the time. I guess a disadvantage can be that depending on what you're studying from a primary source, they could be greatly influenced by profound difficulty and challenges, which means that it would be reflective of that individual's hardships that they faced at the time, which is important for us to know. But during hardship, maybe that could have a consequential impact on sort of reasoned and logical feelings about things. You know, if you're someone being persecuted, obviously you're going to have very, very strong feelings about being persecuted, right? So, you know, primary sources can be very, very much tempered by emotion, okay, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Secondary material has the ability of, you know, hindsight is 20/20. We're removed from the emotional turmoil of that experience, and we're looking at it trying to find truth, trying to find reason. So secondary sources can oftentimes make judgments on primary sources, right? The values and judgments to be found in secondary sources can reflect bias, okay? And of course, bias means sort of coming at something from a particular point of view. Whether we're talking about ideology, you know, left-wing, right-wing, whether we're coming from, you know, bias is basically, you know, reflective of a certain person's judgment based on a certain point of view. If your family, you know, was persecuted during the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s, your reflection on that experience are going to be heightened by great emotion and certainly will be very, very negative, right? Because your personal experience and your family's personal experience was very negative, right? So secondary sources are very, very useful but can be tinged with bias as well. So, I mean, the same could be said with primary sources. How can a secondary source, something written after the time it studies, also be a primary source? This is an interesting idea. Well, the famous History of the Reformation by Leopold von Ranke, or Rank, depending on your pronunciation, written in the 1840s, is an important secondary source for any study of the Reformation because it's written after it. But that same book is a primary source for the study of 19th century German thought, because Ranke's work reflects dominant trends in contemporary German philosophy of history. Okay? So let me give you an example. There was one book I had many years ago by a Dutch historian. His name was Peter Gale, pronunciation once again I'm not sure of, but he wrote a book called Napoleon For and Against. And what he did was he took articles and things written about Napoleon from, you know, the era of the French Revolutionary period and the Napoleonic Wars right up to like the 1950s, and how each time that Napoleon was written about would be reflective of the time in which it was written about. Let me give you another example. If you're reading an American history book about American history that was written in the 1950s during the height of the McCarthy era, what impact might that have on the chapters dealing with the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution, right? How, right? So that section would, of course, be demonizing the Soviets, the Red Menace, you know, anti-democratic, horrible place, horrible history, blah, 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 because it reflects pressures that writers may have had and feelings that writers may have had that were reflective of the time in which they lived, right? So that's a very interesting thing. But then that takes us into something called historiography, which is basically what that is, which is kind of the history of history. The history of history, there you have it. Okay, a piece of historical writing is not only influenced by the subject of study, but also by the historical period in which it is written. And this circles back to what I was saying about an American history book written in the 1950s, and how the climate of the 1950s, the anti-communist witch hunts, would somehow permeate much of that history. Certainly when you would look at the history of communism or something like that. So bias can be not just cultural, but it can be framed in a certain period of time. You know, and that's coming back to Peter Gale, Dutch historian. His work on Napoleon For or Against is very useful because we can see that history of history. You know, and the further away we got from the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period, the softer we were on Napoleon, because even though the Napoleonic Wars were massive and destructive, at the end of the day, what that French Revolution claimed to represent became cornerstone to many other societies as they moved towards constitutionalism and democracy. So it's a very interesting idea, and it just forces you to think more than just reading a text and getting a name and a date. You're actually thinking about the history of history. How does history change? I'll give you another example. You read a history book today, and you know, written 30 years after the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union collapses, you know, the reflections on the Soviet Union are not nearly as stark or terrifying as books that were written at the time that the Soviet Union existed. And I use the Soviet example because, of course, you know, we're dealing with, you know, contrasting ideologies, very different points of view on the left and the right. So they're a perfect example of how bias and how time frame can determine how we interpret certain events. So, very interesting. Okay. Commonly accepted, established judgments on specific matters are facts. Facts should be indisputable. Germany invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939. That's pretty much a fact. I don't think anybody's going to argue that one. VE Day was May 8th, 1945. That's pretty well undisputable too. Right? So facts are sort of the things that we need in order to reflect on, to build a narrative, to build a knowledge narrative, a historical narrative. Facts, right? Indisputable things. Facts are the data of history. Opinions are personal and individual conclusions. Okay. Too often, students come into my class and will make some sort of comment about a topic, and I'll know right away that that is not a point of view that they formulated themselves. You know, when I talk about, you know, who influences our opinions? Is it more than just newspapers and books? What about the people in our lives? Our grandparents, certainly our parents, influence how we feel about certain subjects. You grow up at with dinner table conversations with your family. We very naturally adopt the feelings and points of view about certain topics of those of our parents, because we assume as a child growing up that they are correct, that they are right, you know. My father had very strong opinions about politics when I grew up, and I knew nothing, so I just assumed that whatever he told me was a fact. I had no reason to dispute that. As I got older and began to find my own voice, you know, and I could challenge him in a respectful way, you know, and we share a lot of common ideas, but we also have different ideas about things too. So, you know, opinions can be mistaken as facts for some people. Some people can think that their point of view or their feelings about a topic is a fact, when in fact it's an opinion. You know, I've had many students come into my class over the years who've said things that have been pretty borderline inappropriate, and I've always got to be very careful in a classroom environment not to single these kids out and make them feel awkward, because I don't want them running home and saying, my teacher said da 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 da, and then before you know it I'm on the phone having an argument with the father, whatever it may be. The trick is having students understand that they have a strong opinion that they've adopted through their social circle. There's nothing wrong with that. The trick is, at some point, finding out if that's how you really feel once you start doing research and understanding different points of view, you know. And at the end of the day, I think more than anything, that's what I hope to achieve with my students, that they understand that how we feel about a certain event is based on point of view. Right now, for example, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and conspiracy theories make me quite angry because they're knee-jerk reactions. They can be very, very convincing, very powerful, and people will just buy it hook, line, and sinker without having done any other research, you know. So, you know, I think you just, as a historian, I can't stress enough how important it is that you draw reasoned judgments and rational conclusions based on doing your own work, going beyond just Googling it or going to Wikipedia. You have to actually go much deeper and further than that to come to that sort of reasoned conclusion. The difficult thing right now that we face in the time we live in right now is, you know, the American administration, the Trump administration, is not having a hard time demonstrating the importance of sound, reasonable, thoughtful judgments about things, that not coming to rash conclusions. We're seeing a real sort of knee-jerk reaction coming out of that administration, and impulsive things being said by Trump, and which can oftentimes cause all kinds of problems. So I think, you know, it's posing a lot of really interesting questions about point of view, about bias, about trying to project an image or convince people to feel a certain way, because we're seeing something very new right now in the United States. It's very interesting, but also troubling at the same time. Opinions are based on personal prejudices of the author or cliches assumed to be true because they are often repeated. That, to me, is key to this. Okay? So, if you grow up, you know, I'll give you an example. And I remember one time I had a student who made some pretty strong comments in a class. We were discussing racism and bigotry, and he made some pretty strong anti-Semitic comments. And I just kind of skirted over it in the class. It wasn't anything too harsh, but it was clearly he was saying something that he didn't fully understand. And at the end of the class, I called him over and said, "Hey, you know, that's pretty strong opinions. I'm glad you have strong opinions, but I'm just curious to know, how did you draw these? What sources did you use to draw these conclusions?" You know, and at the end of the day, he didn't read anything. He, you know, well, my dad says da 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 da. He was very proud of my dad says, and I said, "Good, well, that's good." I said, you know, because my father was my biggest influence, and I understand that. I said, but you know, what would make your argument even more convincing is that if you do more research on different points of view, and you know, that's all I can do, in hopes that they begin to find out real facts, or we study something that is contrary to what they have come to be seen as the truth, and they begin to develop new opinions. And I have seen that happen with students. And yes, sure, maybe they're challenging their father at home a little bit more, but they're doing it because they're exposing themselves to different points of view. So as a history teacher, it's a very delicate balance. Okay, opinions. Okay. Lies by omission is the process of leaving out key information to present a certain point of view. Okay. Now, this process, lies by omission, is used all the time. Let me give you an example. If you don't know anything about the topics I'm going to refer to, I'll explain why this would work. Okay. Let's say you're talking about the leadership of Joseph Stalin. And you said, Joseph Stalin was a strong leader who helped lead the Russian armies to victory in World War II. In addition to that, he was instrumental in the modernization and industrialization of Russia. Is that correct? Yes. Yes, that is correct. However, it's problematic because you've left some key information out. If you don't talk about the Ukrainian famine and genocide of 1932-33, or if you don't talk about Stalin's Great Purges or the Great Terror, where he had political enemies eliminated, or you talk about the show trials, or don't talk about that. So if you leave out all the nasty bits and you focus on just the positive, that is called a lie by omission, because you're lying by what you're not giving the whole story, right? You're giving half of it. You could say the same thing if you use the example of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler brought Germany out of the Depression and brought employment and pride to Germans by 1936. Is that true? It's fair to say absolutely that is true. But if you don't talk about the rounding up of political enemies, the persecution of the Jews, the banning of all political parties, you're only getting half or part of the narrative. You are leaving things out to present a certain point of view. Lies by omission are used all the time. You know, the recent video that was everywhere on YouTube and has now disappeared, called Plandemic, is a classic case of lies by omission. We can be very, very convincing if we only tell you what you want to hear. And we don't even necessarily need to fully lie. We can stretch the truth a bit, but we're going to leave certain things out, maybe. I don't know. I never had a chance to see this film, but certainly it's caused quite a stir. I was curious to watch it because I'm a historian and I like to see things that are contentious and problematic. But from what I understand from people that have seen it and what I've read about it, it seems that there is some serious flaws in this central argument. So lies by omission are the cornerstone, you know, of how you can be convincing by simply leaving something out, you know. So these are all things, I think, that we as historians and you as students and some of you who are also teachers that navigate the principles by which we are obligated, I feel we are obligated to follow, that we are as instructors. It is important that I teach kids how to look at and use primary sources effectively, look at and how to use secondary sources effectively, identify the difference between fact and opinion, and also, most importantly, to understand how lies by omission are used. So as you begin to kind of continue to look for your own voice and find your own feelings about events, or you begin to develop, some of you might even be thinking that, you know, at some point I want to vote. And when I'm 18, I want to vote. And I need to know what I believe in so I know what political party to vote for. You know, then you have to go out and do the research. You have to find out what they stand for. You have to find out the background of the leaders. You have to find out what they've done in the past, and so on and so forth. All of this ties into this stuff, you know, and that's what makes history, I think, so compelling and so interesting. So, that being said, we're going to leave it at that. It gives you something to chew on and think about. And other than that, I appreciate you coming to my lectures and having a look. And we look forward to see you another time. Take care. Bye-bye.